Welcome everybody to SCI-Arc. It's fantastic to see a good crowd on a Friday night, which speaks volumes of the interest to see Gregory or that your social life sucks. So either way, it's a great to see you. So it is my pleasure to introduce Gregory Crewdson. Believe it or not, this is probably one of the trickiest introduction I have to do this year, and I assume many years to come, because I'm a big fan of his work. And it's way easier to introduce somebody you don't like the work so much, because you can frame it in some critical way. And I think his work, as you can see by the presence of so many faculty, is the work of somebody that we follow closely here in SCI-Arc. So it's not so much to introduce who he is, which I think everybody knows. It's more about I'm trying to frame why I think it's important to have him speaking tonight here. In many ways, one could argue that photography as such is probably one of the most closest art disciplines in relation to architecture. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there is a absolutely symbiotic relation between the technology and the mechanisms how operate and how the thing gets filtered in a way that some of the other arts are not so clear. So photography, like David Hockney said not so long ago in a book called Secret Knowledge, it has been around for a long time. What we now know as photography, or actually we don't know anymore since iPhones and digital cameras and all that, but for what we knew for the big majority of the 20th century and the second half of the 19th century was the chemical process of translation of image capture into paper. But as artifacts, optical artifacts, they've really been around since the Renaissance in many ways. So one could argue that there is a direct relation how this has been evolving as part of the creative in terms of the humanist science of art and disciplines. Now, nobody can say with absolutely precision that, for example, Impressionism in painting happens because photography became part of the art. So why you will paint a portrait or a landscape when you can take a picture? But part of the thing also, as I said, the evolution of technology and how these start to operate, in many ways also define the scope of the aesthetic ambitions or the conceptual ambitions. But as we know, in any field and relate to that, and that can apply to music, architecture, and so on and so forth, at the end of the day, it comes down to the ability of the individual, of the artist, what to do with that. And in many ways, photography, like architecture, is very about evolution and genealogy and moving the field inch by inch. And like architecture, sometimes it flirts with irrelevance. And it came back, and it goes back. And what I want to point out, and in these fields, and in our photography in particularly, once in a while, somebody comes along, they completely put the discipline upside down, and it completely change the rule and open the possibility in a whole new territory. And I will say without hesitation that Gregory Crewdson is one of those guys. He's one of those persons that when the history looks back, we will say there is a before and after. And the reason has to do with that, because I cannot think of any living photographer that can capture more the contemporary sense of art ambitions, or what I will say, the now, as a problem to understand, like no, that I think any serious and living art form need to engage on a regular basis. So it's really my pleasure and my honor to welcome Gregory Crewdson to SCI-Arc.
Thank you so much for that. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess first and foremost, I would consider myself a storyteller. That I'm interested in using light and color and form and pictorial space to tell a story. But I think, as you all know, photographs are very limited in terms of their capacity to tell us anything at all. So the kind of stories I tell are elliptical and always remain hovering as a kind of question mark. today I'm going to give you a kind of retrospective of my work, beginning with early work that I did when I was a graduate student at Yale in the late 80s. And you can see from these early pictures that at its core, the pictures are preoccupied with themes and concerns and obsessions that I still deal with today in my current pictures. So I guess what I'm saying is that every artist has one central story to tell. And the task is to try to tell and retell that story over and over again and reinvent it in some way and try to make that story, renew that story, but still always sort of circling around the central concerns and interests. My pictures have always hovered around or between reality and fiction. And I've always been interested in using the photograph in a way to attempt to take real life and ordinary situations and make them beautiful and make them mysterious and make them psychological in some way. I've always told the story that I grew up in Park Slope in Brooklyn, and my father was a psychoanalyst, and he had his office in the basement of our house, in our beneath their living room. And one of my earliest memories as a child was attempting to listen to the floorboards and try to create an image of what I thought I heard beneath the surface of the living room floor. And for me, that was like an aesthetic awakening in some kind, or at least it's a very strong metaphor that I think I carry with me throughout all of my pictures, and that is, I think I was too young to understand what was happening beneath the surface of our living room floor, but I knew what was occurring was mysterious, forbidden, secret. And I think throughout my work, I've tried to find secrets in everyday life in one way or another. From early on, I've been making photographs in this one area in Massachusetts, in a series of towns. And I've sort of gone to that area over and over again. And again, I wasn't particularly interested in documenting the place, but using it as a backdrop to create my own sort of stories. This picture particularly was of interest to me. It was still, I find it very sort of significant to me. It's looking through a suburban window out into a baseball field. And I just love how the window divides interior and exterior space, and how the light from the baseball field transforms the ordinary vernacular into a place of mystery. But even back then, I wasn't, in terms of storytelling, I wasn't interested in literal narratives. I was interested in using light and color to try to express an internal story, something that was unavailable to us in a certain way. And even early on, interested in how light can transform an ordinary landscape and make it feel, give it sort of a new meaning, a new sense of beauty. This is an early collaboration with the fire department, who I've worked with many, many times. And here I convinced them to set that house on fire for me, or that shack, which they were very happy to do. I like the impotent stream of water coming out of that hose. It's like a kind of beautiful little domestic still life that has so many different representations of nature. And there's a little note that says, "Need toilet paper." So all this work you've just seen was my thesis show at Yale. And as I said earlier, I think it gives traces of, it gives indications of what I will go on to, deal with throughout my artistic career. But soon after making this picture, I had a moment of, after leaving school, after graduating, of I'm sure most of you might be able to relate to this, a certain sort of sense of terror of what might happen next in my work, crisis point. And I started sort of to question my picture-making activity. And I left graduate school, and I wound up going to move into my parents' cabin in Massachusetts. And for some unknowable reason, I started making these dirt piles in my backyard of my parents' house and photographing it over and over again. And over the course of this one period, I must have made hundreds of these piles. But I never, if that sounds strange, it was made even stranger by the fact that I never developed any of that film, so I don't have those images to show you. But I do have some sequences from Close Encounters of the Third Kind to try to explain my activity. And this is, to me, like Steven Spielberg's great masterpiece. And as you remember, the main protagonist witnesses a series of extraterrestrial events, and in an attempt to try to make sense of that, he starts to irrationally starts making these piles or totems out of sort of domestic material, like in this case, shaving cream. And as he does, he sort of says over and over again to himself, like,
I found this overnight tanning stuff.
This is important, this is meaningful. And this activity now graduates to mashed potatoes. And as he continues to sort of pursue this, he becomes increasingly alienated from his family and his community. And for me, this is like a great metaphor for like the artist's activity. Like you're pursuing something that's outside of your reach, that feels like trying to solve a mystery. And then this activity's climaxes with this beautiful scene where he makes this totemic structure in his living room out of materials he finds in his garden. And to me, this is such a powerful image because it creates a complete collision between different oppositions that I'm very interested in, like between interior and exterior space, and between the domestic and nature, and between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Here's the window again. That's a kind of separation device. I think maybe I over-relate to him. But my dirt piles, this kind of, back to me, the dirt piles slowly but surely became my next body of work, which I produced in the early 90s, called Natural Wonder, and these were dioramas. These were produced in my studio, these tableaus that dealt with like nature and domesticity. And they were entirely built by hand by me. Each picture taking over a month to produce. This is before computer intervention, so they're essentially straight pictures of these tableaus. But they continue the theme of like sort of beauty and a certain kind of darkness. They were very influenced by, obviously, David Lynch, who had a huge impact on me when I was a graduate student. Blue Velvet. The pile again. Fake dirt. Dead fox. The window with moths. And that's a cast of my leg with thorns growing out of it. Needless to say, I was going through a dark period in my life. But this ended, this picture was like the final image in this series. And then I began to have these dreams of floating. And I left New York and for various personal reasons, and moved back into my parents' little log cabin and made my next series of pictures, which was these black and white photographs called Hover. And they were all taken from the vantage point of an elevated crane looking in on a little neighborhood where like certain kind of sort of odd events were occurring. This is a picture of a woman who planted lines of flowers down the middle of her street, for example. So we made these pictures, and I used just the people in the neighborhood to do it. Like that woman lived in that house. Her husband was a landscaper. One Sunday afternoon, we just made those lines of flowers, and I got into the crane and took the picture with an 8x10 camera. No one seemed to notice whatsoever. Another circle. Here's a picture of a man obsessively covering the street with sod, making a connection between his yard and the people across the street. And I was doing this, I love sod, by the way, it's one of my favorite materials. And we did this picture. We had to like drag people out from their houses to like look on as witnesses. And then at the very last moment, I called down to my assistant and I said, call 911 and tell the police there's a man sodding his street closed. And then 5 minutes later, the police car came, and that's him just walking to the scene. I wanted that policeman to kind of contradict the utopic moment, undermine it in some way. This is a picture of a stuffed bear and the town dog catcher. And there's a perfect line of Wonder Bread between the bear and the dog catcher. And dog catcher's holding one piece of Wonder Bread and a gun in his hand. Another picture of another circle. This one, I think I have I like to tell this story associated with this picture. I had this idea, I wanted to make a perfect circle of mulch in the backyard. So I found what I thought was the right location for this picture. And then I knocked on the homeowner's door to see if I could get permission. And I wrote the person a note. I wrote, "Dear homeowner, I'd like to make a perfect circle of mulch in your backyard and photograph it from the elevated point of view of a crane." And I left my name and phone number. And the very next day, there was one message on the answering machine. And I always regret not saving that message because it was such a lovely, it was great words of wisdom for any artist. And she said, "Do what you have to do." So that's my advice to all of you. It's my only advice to you. The next series was a return to color, and it wound up being really important change in the work. And I started for the first time working with a team of people, including a director of photography, this guy, Rick Sands, and we started using light in a more choreographed way. So we started using light more cinematically. And that welcomed this big change in my work where light started to play a much more major role in terms of the story. But we did it as a kind of ragtag team early on. You know, it was just, again, no permits, no permissions, and we would tie into people's houses to get electricity without insurance. But it felt very exciting because felt like we were doing something very new, where I think, starting to make a photographic language that, to a certain extent, felt like it was reinventing the medium in a certain way. That's an early example. This was actually in someone's house where we built this garden and lit it. And so it was like this great intervention between myself and this town. And then at a certain point, I started working on a sound stage rather than in interiors, where you have a greater sense of control. So I started designing these spaces and picking the wallpaper and the colors, and so it was, again, and then lighting it in a more kind of complex way. In this one, we literally built a living room and then built a tank around it and filled it with water. I wasn't conscious of it at the time, but this was maybe a self-portrait as me as a child, listening beneath the floorboards, searching for secrets. And there was a period where I it's a short sort of series of pictures where I just on my own made a series of pictures of fireflies I photographed fireflies for the entire summer. And I was always entranced by fireflies and was thought of them as magical and an elemental level, very connected with what I do with my overall with my photography, is that I try to use light to tell a story. And then my next really big body of work, which was epic in many ways, and was Beneath the Roses, where at this point, Beneath the Roses was maybe 7 years in the making. It was 8 different productions. And now we're making pictures on the scale of like a movie. Where we close down streets and use lighting and set design in a much larger scale. but the pictures become the narrative events in the pictures become more incidental, quieter in tone. But the scale of the pictures become more operatic. And here are some of the pictures, again, on soundstage. Interiors become more elaborate, more detailed, more involved in framing devices. We did a series of pictures, snow pictures. This is a picture of a boy named Shane. He would follow us around like while we were making the pictures, and I became kind of entranced with him. This is on a soundstage. It's called Birth, and I modeled the motel on Psycho. So it's the motel in Psycho. But rather than a crime scene, we see it like a birthing scene. But it was really important to me that like the mother and the child were not touching, to create a certain kind of ambivalence. Use a rain machine here to create rain. Here are some behind the scenes of the making of the pictures to give you a sense of the scale of the photographs in terms of the production. So we always have lights in elevated lifts to give that kind of backlight. Here are some pictures behind the scenes in the pictures we made on a soundstage. Some of the early illustrations. This is of the birthing scene. So I wanted to make a picture of a burning house. So we had a meeting with the fire chief of the town of Pittsfield. And the very next day, he produced all these houses for us and to burn, like a whole array of choices here. But we wound up using this one house that, and that's Rick, my director of photography, but we wound up doing a controlled burn rather than burn the house down.
It's 80 feet up. I love it.
Okay, turn on the fire and the smoke.
That's fine. Cut it back, Nathaniel. Cut it back, cut it back, cut it back, cut it back.
No. That is so beautiful.
Okay?
Fucking amazing.
Very good.
Fucking amazing. Go. Clear frame.
Clear frame.
This is for actors. Let's see. Okay, let me look at everyone's position.
Let's see positions.
Okay, so
Yeah, because cut.
9 should now sort of pivot her body or her body towards the burning house. And then look at, okay, perfect.
Perfect.
Okay,
Okay.
good. Let's start shooting.
Okay, good.
Yeah, that's good. You could cut.
You have doors on that, right?
Okay,
Okay. Position.
and hold.
Oh.
Okay, do it again.
Cut going again. Go again.
What at 32?
No.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect.
Position. This is the final picture. So Beneath the Roses ended after 8 years of working on this very big scale. The next body of work, I want to do something much quieter in tone, and it's the only time I've really ever photographed outside of this country. I made a series of pictures on the back lot of Cinecittà Studios in Rome, and just of the old sort of remnants of movie sets. And I think that, like, although there's very obvious differences between the bodies of work, that there's also connections between, photography and movies, and a certain kind of beauty and sadness. But I used only ambient light, and but I found the places very powerful, very sad and beautiful. In a certain way, these pictures were like a love letter to documentary photography, to like photographers like Ache and Walker Evans. And then I want to end with some of you might know I have a show of a new body of pictures up currently in New York at Gagosian Gallery called Cathedral of the Pines. And to me, they are pictures that are very, very sort of close to my heart, and have a lot of personal meaning to me. So I'll show you some of the pictures, and I hope that maybe some of you maybe got a chance to see it in New York, and we're certainly will be in Los Angeles at some point soon. They were all made in Beckett, and they marked a return to working in color, and a return to the psychological, but in a much more sort of intimate and private way. They're all done on location. And they're interiors and exteriors. And like my earlier pictures, there's a really important connection between the interior and exterior spaces. And I feel like they're more painterly than cinematic, but we can certainly talk about that later. Thank you.